Welcome, beloved soul. The angels are with you right now, wrapping you in their golden light, their warm wings gently folded around your heart. You are seen. You are loved. You are protected. Welcome to Angel's message for you. This message was divinely guided, and it found you because it was meant for you. Stop everything you are doing right now, because what you are about to hear could change the entire direction of your life. Something is already moving in the unseen world. Something beautiful, something real, something heaven itself prepared just for you. And if you stay until the very end of this message, you are going to understand why your heart has been feeling that quiet pull, that gentle whisper, telling you that something extraordinary is about to arrive. Stay with me. Every single word of this message matters. Dear one, something very important is about to happen in your life. And this time, it is not just a possibility. It is a certainty sent from heaven. It is about someone who is on the way. Someone who carries everything you ever asked for in prayer. Even on the nights when you thought no one was listening, even when the silence around you felt too heavy to carry, this person was being carefully prepared for you. They hold a mission, a beautiful, divine mission, and that mission is to walk into your life and transform it from the inside out. This person is your soulmate. Dear one, this is no ordinary love. It is not a repeated story. It is not something you have lived before. It is the arrival of someone who will take exactly the right place in your life. Someone who is not coming to fill what is missing, but to walk right beside you, step by step at exactly the right time, with actions that show truth, willingness, and a presence that does not waver. That is why you need to listen carefully right now, because this arrival cannot be blocked by old fears, by past mistakes that left scars, or by the mistrust that the world may have planted inside you over the years. Heaven chose this moment because it saw that you are ready. More than that, it saw that you need this presence by your side. Your soulmate is already being guided to you, and this connection has something incredibly special about it. It did not start right now, but now is exactly when it will take a real shape. It will move beyond signs and scattered feelings and become something alive, something present, with real touch, with honest exchange, with deep truth. The person who is arriving has their heart completely turned toward you. They carry a genuine desire to build a life together. This is not someone who is lost or unsure of what they want. This is someone with plans, with clarity, with love stored up inside them and ready to give. And you need to be prepared to recognize this when it happens, because the risk of blocking this arrival out of fear, confusion, or the habit of overprotecting yourself is very real. And that is exactly what the angels came to warn you about. There is no point in asking heaven for someone special if when that person finally arrives, you close the door out of insecurity. There is no point in waiting for a different kind of love if deep inside you still act as though everyone is the same. What is coming now is different. It is someone who loves in a clean way, with clear intentions, with feelings that are mature and grounded. And one more detail worth knowing. This person carries a fresh, youthful energy. They have the kind of light that brings a sense of ease into your life. They have the courage to make real plans, and they have a true intention to build a family with you, not in some distant, faraway future, but now. This revelation is not just a promise. It is a calling for you to step out of defense mode, to make room for this love to grow, to allow yourself to be loved in a way you may have never fully experienced before. Because this soulmate who is drawing closer already feels a rare and deep affection for you. A connection that goes beyond any simple explanation. And all this person wants is to be welcomed, openly, fully, without walls. The angels did not come to give you vague hope. They came to prepare you for a real experience, for an encounter that will change your routine, that will turn moments of emptiness into beautiful sharing, that will lift the weight from your shoulders and replace it with warm companionship. Your love is on the way. It is close, and it did not come to play with your heart. It came to add to your life, to walk with you, to respect who you are while also gently awakening the very best within you. This person has already thought about what it would be like to share life with you. They have imagined daily details. They have felt the deep desire to show you everything they carry inside their heart. They are not coming out of curiosity. They are coming by decision, by feeling, and above all, by divine purpose. Because the two of you have something extraordinary to live together. Something that cannot be wasted by fear or sabotaged by emotional walls that no longer serve you. Dear one, you do not need to hide again. You do not need to armor yourself as though the world is always about to hurt you. The time has come to make room and to finally live what heaven prepared with such patient, loving care. The angels know that part of you may still want to protect itself. That is why this message is arriving before everything unfolds, so you know what is coming, so you do not close yourself off, so you are ready to receive it with an open heart. This person is not arriving by chance. They are being spiritually guided, and everything that was aligned in the invisible realm is already moving in favor of both of you. The days of deep loneliness will give way to beautiful sharing. Moments of doubt will be replaced by concrete actions. You will no longer carry everything alone. And the most beautiful part of all is this: the one who arrives does not come to demand anything from you or to try to change who you are. They come to welcome you exactly as you are, to add to your life, to grow with you side by side. Heaven wants you to understand this clearly. Do not place unnecessary barriers between yourself and this person, because if this closeness is blocked by doubt, pride, or resistance rooted in the past, you could miss the most beautiful moment of your life. Not because love will leave, but because you might fail to recognize the right time to open your heart. And that is the great calling of right now. Do not block your soulmate. This is not about predicting the future. It is about recognizing what is already right in front of you. You were chosen to live a true love, a love that builds, that adds, that fills, and that gives brand new meaning to your days. It is someone who already thinks of the two of you as one, who wants to see you well, who wants to see you happy, who wants to build a home with you just as you always dreamed deep inside. So what the angels ask of you now is simply this: stay open. Listen all the way through, because what is about to be revealed will prepare your heart to receive this person in exactly the right way. Dear one, today is one of those rare days when everything changes, even if on the outside everything still looks the same. The time to live a full and complete love has arrived. It has come as a direct answer to everything you ever held in silence. To the days when you thought you were completely alone in the world. To the moments when your heart longed for someone, but you no longer knew if that would ever truly happen. The time that heaven saved just for you has arrived. What is beginning to open now is not just a new phase of life. It is a path that was carefully and lovingly built while you were still trying to understand life itself. You went through cycles. You faced many things. You held yourself together when everything felt too heavy to carry. And even without realizing it, every single part of that journey served to prepare your heart to receive someone who will not just pass through. This person will stay. They will build. They will be part of everything that comes from now on. This moment does not arrive by chance. It comes because heaven understood that now, yes, right now, you are ready to live something whole. And more than that, heaven also understood that the love chosen to be with you is equally ready. Your soulmate has already made decisions, has already made choices, has already felt that life only truly makes sense by your side. And that is why this revelation is being delivered right now, because everything that needed to be aligned has already been aligned. What is coming cannot be wasted. You have something extraordinary to live with this person. And this is not just a beautiful idea. It is a promise that is about to leave the realm of waiting and enter your everyday life. Because the love that is arriving comes with real action. It comes with a willingness to share the heavy burdens, to add to the joyful moments, to hold your hand when life feels tight and uncertain. This person already knows what they want, and what they want is to live something true, light, and deeply real with you. No games, no stalling, no fear of going all in. Heaven prepared this meeting with tremendous patience. Every detail was lovingly cared for, and when you least expect it, you will realize that what once felt so distant is now part of your daily routine. This person will show you how much simpler life can be when two hearts sincerely choose each other. Not because everything will be perfect or without challenge, but because you will both be walking in the same direction together. And that changes absolutely everything. You do not need to carry old fears as though they were eternal truths. The time of doubting has passed. What begins now is a time to believe. Not out of loneliness, not out of need, but because the time has finally come to live with someone the things you have always wanted to feel: security, peace, truth. That feeling that life has placed someone on your path who truly makes sense. Someone who, this time, will not leave. In the coming days, you will notice things beginning to fall into place. Not because everything suddenly becomes perfect, but because your energy is fully ready to recognize what is truly worth holding on to. And when this person appears, you will not need to ask anything at all. You will simply feel that it makes sense. You will see it in their actions, in the way they look at you, in the way they listen and care for you without needing to prove a single thing. This new season arrives with a strength you may never have felt before. Because now it is no longer about waiting for love to show up. It is about being completely ready to receive it. And that preparation did not happen on the outside. It happened in every quiet decision you made not to give up, even when everything felt discouraging. It happened in the times you chose not to, completely shut down even while you were afraid of being hurt again. And that is precisely why heaven now releases this blessing, because it saw that you did not harden your heart. You simply waited for what truly makes sense. Your love is not lost. It is coming, and it brings with it a deep desire to build a life alongside you. Not a perfect life, but a real one. A life of true partnership, beautiful lightness, and plans that are actually possible. This person has already understood that it does not take much to be happy. Just having you there, being exactly who you are, sharing the days, creating memories, laughing at simple everyday things, and facing challenges together as a team. Heaven does not mark time by accident. This revelation arrives now because the exact point has come when everything begins to open. This love will no longer remain distant. And yes, you will need courage, but not the heavy, exhausting courage of someone who fights completely alone. It will be the light courage of someone who allows, of someone who lowers their defenses and lets life beautifully happen. Because this person will give you real reasons to believe. They will show you through actions that they are here to add to your life and that there is no longer any reason to hide behind mistrust. This connection that is approaching is coming to change the entire way you see life. It comes to heal that part of you that still secretly believed love was only meant for some people and not for you. You will feel in practice that love was absolutely reserved for you too, and that now is the time to live it with peace, with surrender, and with wide open space in your heart. It is important that you understand something deeply right now. Heaven is not just gifting you with someone special. It is handing you a whole story, a real choice, a genuine possibility to love and be loved with lightness. Your soulmate is coming with a firm and beautiful intention to build a life with you. And even if the outside world tries to make you doubt, the angels tell you with complete certainty, this love is an answer, and it was saved for exactly this time. Do not look at this moment through the tired eyes of the past. Do not repeat within yourself the same old patterns that kept you from what you most deeply desired. Life is offering you a brand new opportunity, and it will only bloom if you are willing to see it with fresh, open eyes. What has passed has passed. Now is a new time, and this new time calls for real action. It asks that you do not run. Do not sabotage yourself. Do not hide from what is arriving. This person has serious plans and a sincere desire to build a family with you. They carry a kind of love that does not demand perfection but quietly asks for commitment. Not the kind that weighs you down, but the kind that embraces you fully. The kind that chooses to stay. The kind that understands that loving is also about caring deeply, and that caring is choosing every single day, deliberately and lovingly, to be together. Dear one, the person who was chosen to walk by your side is not far away. And when we speak of closeness, we are not only talking about physical distance but about the bond between the two of you, which is more alive and active than it has ever been. Your soulmate is drawing closer with a feeling so firm and so clear that it no longer fits only inside thought. And what this person wants now is to show up, to be present in your days, to live something that until now had been quietly kept inside their heart. This approach is filled with intention. It is not a coincidence, not passing curiosity, and certainly not a movement without direction. What this person feels for you has purpose, has deep roots, and has true and genuine desire. This closeness is not meant to clear a doubt, but to confirm a certainty that has been growing little by little, day by day. And now that certainty has turned into a clear and beautiful decision. Your soulmate's heart is full of plans, and every single one of those plans has you at the very center. Your name is there when they think about the future. Your presence appears when they imagine the home they want to lovingly build. This person is ready to be part of your life in exactly the right way. Present, adding real value, offering the most beautiful parts of themselves, and above all bringing a lasting peace to what the world so often stirred up inside you. And when the angels say this person is close, it is because a preparation is already well underway. Life has begun to align the details. Opportunities are quietly arising. And even if it seems subtle right now, very soon everything will be right before your eyes. What is forming between you is strong, sincere, and unlike anything you have ever lived before. Because now it is no longer about trying to make things work with just anyone. Now it is about living fully with someone who was spiritually meant to be with you. This closeness carries a beautiful weight. It comes with direction, with action, with the deep desire to begin something that has a solid and unshakable foundation. Your soulmate is not only wishing to be with you, they are actively moving to make it happen. And that makes all the difference in the world. Wanting something is one thing. Acting with love and responsibility is something else entirely. And that is exactly what is happening right now. You will notice that paths will begin to cross in unexpected and wonderful ways. Certain conversations will arise at exactly the right moment. Something inside you will seem to call you to open yourself a little more. Do not ignore these signs. These are divine confirmations, small and gentle openings that life gives you, so you can see clearly that you are not alone, and that the love you have dreamed of for so long is drawing closer with increasing strength and beauty. This person does not want to show you a beautiful side just for appearances. They want to be real with you. They want to share what they feel, what they think, what they carry within. And there is something important for you to understand. This person is not coming to complete what is missing in you, but to share what is light, what is sincere, and what is truly possible. And that alone already changes the weight of every choice you make from here on. This person's heart is completely at peace with the decision they have made. And part of that peace comes from what they feel for you. This is not an invented love. It is not a rushed love. It is a love that matured over time, through experiences and lessons learned. That is why the desire now is to build something deeply real, to look into your eyes with full certainty and say quietly, "I choose you to walk with me." It is not an exaggeration to say that this closeness has the power to change the way you see relationships entirely. Because when someone arrives with clarity and consistent action, there is no more room left for insecurity or doubt. Everything begins to be built on what is real. And when you truly feel this, you will experience a peace you have not felt in a very long time. It will be light. You will feel completely safe. This person carries a deep and genuine affection for you, one that comes straight from the heart. It is not a surface-level feeling that appears only when it is convenient. It is something that pulses with steady intention, that moves toward you, that thinks about the next day and includes you in every single detail. Your soulmate does not want to convince you with pretty words. They want to show you through presence and real action that what they feel is true, that what they desire is possible, that what they are building together with you is genuine. This phase of your life marks an incredibly important turning point, the shift from expectations to living actual experiences. You will no longer need to imagine what it would be like to be truly loved, because now you will live it. You will feel day after day the care of someone who genuinely wants to see you well, who listens, who shows up, who walks by your side without ever making you question their intentions. Your soulmate comes with a different kind of desire, steady, grounded, with eyes fully focused on you. And this closeness will cause everything inside you to begin to fall beautifully into place. Thoughts that once felt confused will gain real clarity. The insecurity that used to quietly paralyze you will begin to lose its grip, because the love that arrives now will not ask you to prove anything at all. It will simply invite you to live together with calm, with ease, and with beautiful mutual exchange. And the closer this person comes, the more clearly you will understand that life was preparing you for this exact moment. Not as a long and painful waiting game, but as a sacred path of deep preparation. Because what comes now asks for surrender. It asks for openness. It asks for the quiet courage to accept that what you have dreamed of for so long is right here, right in front of you, ready to be fully lived. It is important for you to know this. Your soulmate is offering you a new and beautiful space, a space of genuine welcome, deep respect, and true reciprocity. And all this person wants is for you to be willing to offer the same in return. Because loving is not about desperate effort. It is about mutual surrender. It is about care flowing freely on both sides. It is about building together, day by day, with patience and loving intention. This connection is not just beginning now, but now is when it will become visible, tangible, and present in your everyday routine. That is why it is so important for you to stay aware and awake. Not to close doors out of old fear of being hurt. Not to reject what was sent to you as a divine blessing just because things once did not work out. This person is not responsible for what has passed. They deserve the full and open chance to show what they can build with you from this moment forward. You will notice that this person's presence will be different. It will carry truth. It will carry genuine care. it will carry the clear and beautiful desire to stay. And in that presence, you will see everything your heart has always longed for but never quite fully found. Because when it is truly the right person, nothing needs to be forced at all. The connection simply happens at the right time in the right way. Dear one, this person is approaching you with sincere feelings, a pure and open intention, and a genuine desire to share life with you completely. But for this to happen the way it was truly meant to, you will need to pay close attention to how you have been reacting when someone tries to get close to you with real affection. The fear that has quietly built up inside you over time may be more present than you even realize. And if you do not gently address it now, you could end up closing the door on someone who only wants to love you with everything they have. This is not about blame. It is about honest and loving awareness. It is about understanding that yes, you have been through difficult and painful things, but you cannot treat every attempt at closeness as a threat. Not everyone who comes near wants to repeat a painful story. Not every new love has to pay the price for what once hurt you. What is coming now is completely different. And the real danger is not being able to see that in time. Sometimes the one who longs most to be loved is also the one who protects themselves the most. And that kind of deep protection, after everything you have been through, becomes almost automatic and unconscious. But too much protection also blocks the very thing you want most. And when you put up that invisible barrier without even realizing it, the one who is genuinely arriving can feel rejected, even when that was never your intention. Your soulmate does not deserve to carry the weight of disappointments they never caused. This person is coming with loving action, with a true willingness to add and to build something real. But that simply cannot happen if you keep closing yourself off before even seeing what is truly right in front of you. Sometimes the right and beautiful opportunity knocks but finds a locked heart, not out of cruelty but out of habit, out of fear, out of the exhausting pattern of expecting nothing good from others anymore. But now it is different. Heaven is bringing you someone with firm and clear intention, with a genuine desire to stay, with love in their eyes and truth in every single action. And you need to fully understand that this kind of love requires real and open space to grow. It cannot be lived with constant fear or with insecurity fueled by old stories that are long over. It is time to stop hiding behind excuses. It is time to give a real and open chance to something that has everything it takes to be completely different from what you have known before. This is not about accepting just anything. It is about not letting slip away someone who truly and sincerely came to stay. Because the person who is coming does not want to force you into anything. They simply want to be received with the love and respect they deserve. They want to show what they feel. They want to prove that love still exists, grounded, directed, and beautifully caring. And if you close yourself off before getting to know them, before really seeing them clearly, you could lose something you prayed for so deeply and for so long. This kind of inner blockage shows up in subtle ways. Sometimes it is a suspicious look. Sometimes it is a sharp word said without thinking. Other times it is the quiet distance you create the moment you realize you are starting to feel too much. And the problem with all of this is that it sends the wrong message to someone who is genuinely and lovingly trying to get close. The right person will not push where they do not feel welcome. And if that pushing away continues, even unintentionally, this beautiful chance could quietly slip away. You were prepared to live a real and whole love. And heaven would not place this person on your path without profound reason. But it will not force you to live something you are not yet ready to receive. That is why this message matters so much right now. It is here to gently wake you up before you repeat behaviors that no longer match the beautiful new phase of your life. You need to let go of what has already passed. Stop protecting yourself with old weapons that were never meant to stay this long. Stop expecting everything to repeat itself. Because when you expect the very worst, even the most beautiful things start to feel dangerous. And that is deeply unfair, to you and to the one who is coming to love you for real. Your soulmate does not want to fight against your barriers. They want to stand by your side. They want to be part of your life without having to beg for a space to belong in. This love was sent with divine purpose. It was spiritually aligned to arrive at exactly the right time. But now you need to do your part. Allow it. Allow this feeling to grow and breathe. Allow this person to come closer. Allow lightness to gently replace the weight you have been carrying for so long. This will not all happen overnight, but it must begin right now. You do not need to accept everything without discernment, but you also cannot keep turning away from everything that has the potential to go beautifully right. Do not sabotage yourself. Do not repeat patterns that have already pushed good and wonderful things away from you before. Look carefully at what is emerging in your life right now. Evaluate it with your heart. Feel it honestly and openly. But above all, do not push it away before getting to truly know it. Do not block it before allowing yourself to see it clearly. This person is coming with the real courage to give themselves fully, with the desire to live something light, genuinely beautiful, and deeply mutual. And if you make room, you will realize that what is arriving is exactly what you asked the universe for so many times. Do not make the mistake of thinking everything is the same as before, because it is not. And this time, what is coming to you has intention, has direction, and has a real future ahead. The choice is yours right now. And that is why this revelation is being given before everything unfolds. Because heaven wants to see you fully and completely happy. But you cannot live a complete love if you continue acting as though love itself were still a danger. It is not. The right love does not hurt. The right love cares with consistency and warmth. And that care is already on its way to you. It is close. And it only needs one single thing to happen, that you allow it. Dear one, your love is living something new, something strong that has been growing at a pace that is hard to contain. And the beautiful center of it all is you. Everything this person has been feeling over the past days has taken shape around one single and clear desire, to be by your side. Not just in any way, but with intention, with respect, and with complete surrender. This is not just attraction or passing interest. It is a real and living feeling. Your soulmate's heart has been beating differently when they think of you. What once was a quiet and soft desire has now become a real and undeniable need to be part of your life. This person is realizing that no feeling they have ever had before comes close to comparing with what they feel right now. That is why this deep urge to be close does not fade, does not lessen, and does not get lost along the way. On the contrary, it grows stronger with every single passing day. This love has grown with such genuine truth that it no longer fits only inside the imagination of the one who feels it. Now, more than anything else in the world, this person wants to find a way to turn that feeling into beautiful and real action, to show you that what they feel is not ordinary or born of loneliness. It is something that was born with sacred intention and has been strengthened with every thought, with every plan that places you at the center. This person has stopped many quiet times to reflect deeply on what they are feeling. They have tried to fully understand why this feeling has taken up so much precious space inside them. And even without having all the answers, one thing has become crystal clear. You move their heart in a way that no one else ever has. That is not any kind of exaggeration. It is the honest reflection of a connection that time cannot erase, that days cannot weaken, and that ordinary routine cannot ever suffocate. When they think of you, this person feels a beautiful mix of calm and intensity all at once. It is as if there is a deep inner peace and at the same time a good and warm urgency to have you close, to share real moments, to look into your eyes and say everything that has been kept quietly inside until now. This someone carries such genuine and heartfelt affection that even without words, the feeling is already vibrating strongly, asking to move forward, wanting to be fully and truly lived. You have taken up an important and treasured space in the heart of someone who loves you deeply. And more than that, you have awakened beautiful dreams, changed real plans, and sparked genuine courage in them. Your soulmate sees in you a kind of love that does not need to be explained. It only needs to be felt. Because when the heart finds what it has been quietly searching for over a long time, there is simply no more room left for doubt. There is only the desire to make it work, to build something beautiful, to protect it, to care for it every single day. This feeling did not begin by accident or coincidence. It formed slowly over time through the beautiful exchange of energy, through a genuine and growing desire to truly be together. And now, after being quietly nourished within for so long, it is asking for real and open space to finally happen in the world. Your soulmate is ready to move beyond thought and to live this love through action. They no longer want to keep what they feel hidden or tucked away somewhere deep inside. The way this person looks at you is entirely different. It is not just physical interest. It is deep admiration, genuine respect, and real enchantment. Every little detail of who you are matters to them. Every gesture you make leaves a beautiful impression. Every memory you share carries real and lasting value. And that only happens when what is born in the heart is completely sincere, when one is not merely seeking company but seeking a true and deep soul connection. When the desire to be together does not come from need or loneliness but from real and beautiful recognition. And the most wonderful part of all is that this feeling came completely naturally. It was not forced, not planned, not manufactured. It was simply and honestly felt. And that is precisely why it carries such tremendous strength. Because when something is born from the pure truth of the heart, it crosses any barrier, breaks through any distance, and overcomes any fear without effort. Your soulmate feels for you something they have never felt for anyone else in their life. And that is what makes this moment so uniquely and profoundly important. This someone has been quietly thinking about ways to draw closer. They do not want to rush carelessly. They want you to feel genuine safety, deep trust, and honest truth in every step. They want you to understand clearly that they are not approaching out of impulse or idle curiosity. They are coming because they can no longer ignore what they feel, because the feeling no longer allows any further postponement. That is why this approach means so much. Comes loaded with genuine and unshakable feeling. This is not someone who will simply pass through your life as just another story. This is someone who truly wants to build a whole and beautiful life with you, who wants to be part of your everyday routine, to know you on your good days and on your hard days and still always choose to stay. This love has caused real inner changes in your soulmate. It has made them think more maturely, act with greater care, and see life in a much lighter and more hopeful way. What they feel for you gives profound meaning to many things that once felt completely empty inside them. This feeling brought real hope. It brought beautiful clarity. It brought the genuine desire to become better in every way. And that kind of feeling is not felt for just anyone. When the heart finds this kind of love, everything truly and completely changes. Priorities shift in beautiful ways. Choices become clearer and more courageous. Fears begin to quietly lose their grip, because what is being felt now has real weight, real presence, and a steadiness that does not shake. Your soulmate feels they have found something genuinely rare in you. And because of that, they are completely willing to do whatever it takes to live this feeling in exactly the right way, without fear, without rushing, but with full and real intention. This someone has already thought about telling you all of this. They have imagined conversations in their heart, planned gentle ways to get closer, and asked heaven quietly for the wisdom to approach you at exactly the right moment. And that moment is coming. Because when love is this deep and this strong, it simply cannot be put off any longer. There is no more hiding, no more pretending not to feel. You are being loved right now in a way you may never have truly experienced before. And the most beautiful part of all is that nothing had to be forced for this to happen. You only had to be who you are. You only had to exist. Because those who truly love do not need grand reasons or perfect circumstances. They see beauty even in the simplest and most ordinary details. And that is exactly how your soulmate sees you every single day. This feeling will not just be spoken. It will be proven through real actions, through consistent care, through quiet presence, and through shared plans and dreams. It will be shown with steadiness, with genuine respect, and with honesty. Because those who truly love do not promise the entire world. They offer something far more precious. They offer their presence. And that offering is already being lovingly prepared for you right now. Your soulmate feels that the love they carry for you has absolutely no comparison. It is unlike anything they have ever lived before in their life. And that is precisely why they want to live this with you, fully, purely, and completely truthfully. Now that you know what is genuinely happening in the heart of the one who loves you, it is time to move forward and understand deeply why you were chosen to live a love exactly like this one. Dear one, this love that is about to arrive in your life is not half-hearted. It does not come halfway, and it certainly does not want you halfway. This person was not guided to you by coincidence or by any lack of better options. Your soulmate carries a deep and unshakable certainty that what they feel for you is far too strong and too real to ever be set aside. And that is because heaven chose the two of you to live a story that cannot be confused with any other story ever written. You were chosen to live something truly complete, something that involves real devotion, easy and natural companionship, and deep mutual respect. Not just everyday partnership, but a presence that shows up in the moments that truly matter. This person wants to be part of your mornings and your quiet late afternoons. They want to walk beside you not only on the good and joyful days, but also on those when everything feels too heavy to carry alone. More than that, they want to be the one who shares life with you through every single phase that is still beautifully yet to come. It is no accident at all that this preparation is happening right now. This phase of your life is filled with deep and sacred meaning. Heaven saw your beautiful willingness to keep moving forward even without having all the answers. And because of that faithful persistence, this love arrives as a divine answer with intention, with clear direction, and with a solid and unshakable foundation. It is not meant to fill an empty space, but to build a complete and beautiful life with you together. This person has real plans and fully understands that the journey ahead must be lived as a true and loving pair, with honesty, loyalty, and genuine commitment to one another. This complete love that is arriving also brings with it something truly rare and precious: peace. Not the kind of surface peace that comes from cold routine or the simple absence of conflict, but the deep and nourishing peace that is born from the right feeling, the right choice, and the right soul connection. This person will gently help you understand, without much effort at all, that when there is real devotion on both sides, everything flows so much more lightly and naturally. and what once seemed so difficult to reach will become beautifully and easily within your grasp. You were not chosen to live half-hearted loves. You were not meant to settle for relationships that only drain your precious energy and leave you feeling empty. What is being lovingly delivered to you now is the real fruit of sincere prayers. It is the true answer to everything your heart, deep down and in its most honest moments, has always desired. But now it is no longer just a desire. It is reality. It is the beautiful beginning of something that has abundant room to grow, to last, and to make perfect sense in every detail of your everyday life. Your soulmate knows exactly what they want, and within that deep desire, you are at the very center. This person already fully understands that what they carry inside is not an ordinary feeling, and for that very reason, they absolutely do not want to waste this extraordinary opportunity. There is within this love a different and beautiful sense of responsibility. Not the heavy weight of pressure, but the gentle commitment to care, to choose to stay, and to build with you what the world does not easily or often offer. Stability, genuine affection, and deep truth. This complete love is not made of empty promises. It proves itself consistently, day by day, in the small and meaningful details and actions. Your soulmate wants to be close in the simple moments. They want to take real interest in what truly matters to you. They want to know how your day went, to celebrate every small achievement alongside you. And they also want to be your steady and loving support on the difficult days, when you need someone who does not give up easily, who does not turn away at the very first obstacle or challenge. Heaven would not have sent a revelation like this one if it were not absolutely certain of what is being so carefully and lovingly prepared for you. Because when a love like this one draws closer, everything around you begins to beautifully align. Paths cross at exactly the right time. Words arrive with exactly the right tone. And feelings grow with exactly the right intensity and depth. That is precisely how you will know with complete certainty that you are living what was truly promised to you. Nothing will be forced. Everything will be built with honesty and real devotion. This person wants to be what genuinely strengthens you, not what exhausts you. They want to add real joy and meaning to your day, not bring confusion or unnecessary noise. And today, that is worth a tremendous amount, because the world is full of empty distractions, hollow relationships, and meaningless encounters. But this love comes to be entirely different. It comes with the intention to stay, with the deep desire to truly know you, and with the rare courage to allow themselves to be fully known by you as well. You were chosen because there is still beautiful space within you to love sincerely and openly. Even after everything you have faced, even on the most difficult days, even when you thought about giving up entirely, heaven saw clearly how much you deserve to be loved fully and completely. And that is why it is sending you someone who recognizes your worth without ever needing you to prove a single thing. This person sees exactly who you are and wants to be with you precisely as you are, with your natural way, with your honest truths, and with your beautiful vulnerabilities. This love does not arrive to turn you into someone different or someone else. It arrives to add to who you already wonderfully are, to walk lovingly by your side, to respect your boundaries, to build something together that truly and deeply makes sense. And when this relationship begins to fully take shape in your life, you will understand clearly that everything that once felt so distant is now completely within your reach. Because this person will not play with your precious feelings. They will not run away when things become difficult. They will face whatever comes. Right there with you, side by side, always. This feeling comes with a deep spiritual foundation, because this was not merely an encounter shaped by human will alone. It was asked of heaven. It was divinely guided. It was fully approved by something far greater than us. That is why this love is truly complete, because it was blessed even before it ever reached you. And now what remains for you is to open your heart with courage, not to just anyone, but to the one who has already decided with full certainty that it is with you they want to live everything that is yet to beautifully come. Dear one, the time has come to share something that was revealed with real and wonderful clarity. The person who is coming to meet you carries a youthful and vibrant energy, and this is not a small or unimportant detail. This carries deep meaning because despite their age, this person already knows with complete certainty what they want. They already have a very clear vision of the future. And within that future, it is with you that they want to build everything. What is being lovingly prepared between the two of you is not a passing phase. It is not something temporary or fleeting. It is meant to truly last. Your soulmate carries a different kind of energy, a beautiful lightness in the way they see and approach life, and at the same time a rare and beautiful firmness. This person carries the clarity of someone who has already made a serious and sacred choice to live this love with you and to build a real and lasting path together. This person thinks of you with warm affection and deep care, but also with quiet determination and strength. They are not coming to play with your feelings or to try something just for the experience of it. They are coming because they carry within their heart a genuine and heartfelt desire to live by your side everything that truly and deeply matters. To create a bond that is not limited only to the present moment, but one that reaches forward into everything that is still beautifully yet to come. And when love arrives like this, with real willingness and beautiful emotional maturity, time itself lovingly aligns. The difference in age will not stand in the way. On the contrary, it will only add to what you have together, because what this person carries is exactly what you need most right now. A firm and clear desire to be with someone, to build a simple life that is full of real and lasting meaning. Your soulmate is not approaching to throw you off balance. They are coming to help you find more balance, more beautiful calm, more clear direction. All of this wrapped in genuine affection, true partnership, and deep and honest truth. This person has already thought seriously about building a family with you, and not as a distant plan to be left for some later time. It is a plan that pulses strongly and clearly, that was spoken openly to God, that has already become a firm and loving intention. This person sees you as part of a very real and concrete future, and they are not at all afraid to say clearly that they dream of a home, of a beautiful shared everyday life, of the daily routine you will build together side by side. And even if people on the outside look on and try to understand this connection using ordinary thinking, it will simply not fit into common patterns or expectations. Because it was not designed based on what others think is right or normal. It was chosen by heaven. It was spiritually authorized and approved. And now it is being gently placed before you to be lived with full surrender and beautiful courage. Because what this person most deeply desires is to love you in a way that heals you, that welcomes you with open arms, that makes you feel completely safe and seen once again. Many people tend to associate youth with uncertainty, but what is coming toward you right now shows exactly the opposite. Your soulmate already knows where they are going, and more than that, they know with absolute clarity with whom they want to get there. This person looks ahead and sees you right there beside them, and that is more than special. It is rare and extraordinary, and that is precisely why you were chosen to live this love. It is very likely that this person will beautifully surprise you with how openly and directly they approach you, with simple actions that are full of deep meaning, with a genuine desire to be present in your everyday routine, to share your good days and your hard days, to talk about everything openly, to be right there for you in the details that most people usually overlook without a second thought. And that is the beautiful moment when you will realize with complete certainty that the difference in age does not matter at all. Not when what exists between you is a sincere and beautiful willingness to live something truly mutual. This connection will bring a brand new and beautiful phase to your life. Lighter, clearer, and more stable than anything you have known before. Because this person will arrive with a completely clean heart, with real room to love you fully, and with the genuine strength to face whatever may be needed. But for this to happen in the very best and most beautiful way, you need to remember what was shared with you before. Do not block this. Do not close yourself off because of old fears that no longer belong to this new time in your life. Do not allow insecurity to speak louder than what heaven is lovingly placing right in your open hands. Your soulmate has a beautiful light of their very own, an energy that will gently awaken things in you that have been quietly dormant for too long. They will remind you what it truly feels like to be cared for without being demanded from, what it feels like to receive genuine affection without having to ask or earn it, what it feels like to love without carrying heaviness. This person will want to build, not drain, to strengthen you, not confuse you. And all of this with one clear and beautiful desire, to live this love in a light and lasting way together. Time is no longer asking you to wait. It is asking you to recognize. This person is not just one more among many who have passed through your life. They are someone who came to break old cycles, to begin a brand new season, to show you lovingly that the right love can arrive in a beautifully simple way and still be the strongest thing you have ever felt. And all this person wants right now is to be received by someone who fully understands and genuinely appreciates the rare value of having someone like this close by. The deep desire to build a family with you does not come from a vague or passing dream. It comes from real and honest faith. It comes from the genuine surrender this person made to God, asking for a real chance to live something with deep purpose. And that beautiful chance has a name. It has a direction. It has a face. And it is you. Your soulmate comes with an open heart, a steady and loving gaze, and the sincere desire to build a solid and beautiful foundation right by your side. And they are not at all afraid of what that requires. On the contrary, they genuinely want to live every part of it with full presence and real responsibility. You will notice that this person is not interested in changing who you are. They are interested in walking lovingly alongside you, in truly respecting you, in sharing openly, in listening with their full heart, in being present and steady when so many others only know how to walk away. And that kind of true and consistent presence will be one of the greatest gifts your life has ever received. A gift you absolutely deserve. A gift that was sent with so much care. And one that now simply needs to be recognized with your open and willing heart. Everything that has been revealed throughout. This message has brought you right here to this exact and important point. And now you know this person exists. They are drawing closer every day. They have serious and beautiful plans with you in mind. And even carrying that beautiful youthful energy, they are more ready than many people you have ever known before. Ready to love, ready to stay, ready to fully live everything that heaven has so lovingly written for both of you together. Dear one, what is about to happen in your life is not the result of chance. It is not merely a beautiful coincidence. The person who is coming toward you arrives as a direct and divine answer to something that was asked for with complete and honest sincerity. This connection was taken to God with real faith, with true intention, with a pure and steady desire to live something clean and lasting. And heaven did not just listen quietly. It answered. Your soulmate prayed, and not just once. These were requests made calmly and with deep surrender, with a kind of honest truth that cannot be explained with ordinary words. It can only be felt. This person did not ask for just anything. They asked specifically for someone to build a real life with. They asked for love with genuine peace, for partnership with deep respect, for connection with real and lasting purpose. And within all of those sincere and heartfelt prayers, one name kept quietly repeating, yours. This person's heart opened fully to ask that love would no longer be confusing or heavy, that it would be simple to live, strong enough to endure the hard days, and light enough to make all the good days even more beautiful. And within that prayer, something even more beautiful was added, that this love would not be lost, that it would not be denied, that it would find exactly the right path. And that is precisely why this sacred request reached the angels. The angels were sent to prepare you, to help you understand that the love that is coming toward you is the direct result of a real and heartfelt spiritual surrender. This is not about someone's random desire. It is about someone who chose you even before knowing what the answer would be. Someone who trusted completely, who believed without reservation, who kept praying faithfully even when no visible signs seemed to appear. This love that is coming to you is an answer with real substance. It has action. It has truth. It carries the full weight of someone who does not want to play with anyone's feelings. It is someone who decided to place their whole heart in God's hands and ask that if they were ever to truly live something beautiful with someone, that person would be you. That the answer would come clearly, without games, without confusion, without doubt. And what this person received from heaven was exactly that, the right and clear direction. And that direction points directly to you. This person did more than simply pray. They made a deep commitment to their own honest feelings. They asked that their path would be guided to cross yours at exactly the right time. They asked that their heart would be protected from all distractions, that only what was truly real and genuine would remain alive within them. And the feeling for you, it remained. It grew. It became firm and unshakable. That is why this person is now drawing closer with such strength and clear intention, and with an open and ready heart. The prayers were not made thinking only of personal desire. Your soulmate prayed for you as well. They asked that your life would be filled with light, that your path would be clear and beautiful, that your heart would be fully ready to recognize this love when it arrived. And more than that, they asked that no pain from the past would ever be able to stop you from receiving the beautiful and sacred thing being sent to you. Now this sincere surrender was made with faith, but also with deep and genuine respect. Because those who pray with real truth know that the answer always comes at exactly the right time. And now that time has truly and beautifully come. Heaven has cleared the way. Everything that needed to be handled spiritually has already been fully worked through. What was blocked is now being completely released. What seemed confusing is becoming clear and simple. Because this person prayed faithfully that you would not be afraid when this connection finally happened. That is why you are receiving this divine revelation right now. Because heaven wants you to know exactly what lies behind this beautiful approach. This is not someone entering your life without knowing what they want. This is someone who prayed with their whole heart to live this with you, and they are coming with a completely clean intention, with exactly the right attitude, and with a heart that is fully and beautifully ready to love you honestly and completely. Every action this person has taken in recent times was done with one single clear intention, not to let this precious feeling die. Even on the days when distance was felt, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain, your soulmate held on firmly and faithfully to what they felt inside. They spoke with God regularly, asking for wisdom not to lose their way, asking for the strength to keep feeling even without any guarantees in sight. And all of that sincere and faithful dedication was fully and lovingly honored by heaven. This person did not ask for haste or rushing. They asked for permission. They asked that when the time was finally right, Everything would happen naturally and beautifully, without force. Amen.